The history books resting on your shelf aren't just records of the past. They are carefully crafted blueprints, designed, to make you accept the status quo. From our earliest days in the classroom, we are fed a sanitized version of antiquity. We are presented with a grand, marble-pillared vision of ancient civilization, a linear, orderly progression that paints the ancients as mere stepping stones to our modern supremacy. We see the idealized statues of Rome, the rigid hierarchy of Egypt, and the disciplined logic of Greece, all presented as a neat, upward climb toward the present day, right? But this polished veneer is a construction, a carefully curated lens. It relies on the absolute omission of the extraordinary. Why is it that the most advanced, autonomous, and disruptive aspects of ancient life, the technologies that defy our current understanding of progress, are routinely scrubbed from the record? Walk through the halls of any major museum, and you are surrounded by the dust of millennia, yet you are guided to look only at what the curators want you to see. They present a narrative of kings, conquests, and tax records, while the evidence of a more sophisticated, perhaps more enigmatic reality is quietly filed away into the archives of the inexplicable. When we look at the precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment, or the complex decentralized movements that existed in the shadows of the Roman Empire, we aren't just looking at archaeology. We are looking at evidence of a world that refused to be managed by the constraints we are told were inevitable. I mean, this history isn't just old news, it is a closed book, sealed to ensure that you never question the foundations of the system you live in today. If we accept the simple story, we accept the simple position we occupy within it. But once you begin to peel back the layers of this architect's illusion, you find a past that is far more vibrant, more dangerous, and far more free than the textbooks would ever dare to admit. The history books on your shelf describe a world of linear progression, a tidy narrative where humanity moved from the dust of primitive life into the structured embrace of empire. We are told, quite firmly, that ancient societies were fragile things, desperate for the firm hand of a god-king to keep chaos at bay. They paint a picture of millions of shivering subjects, eternally subservient, waiting for a central authority to provide the grain, the law, and the structure of their very existence, But as you dig into the limestone foundations of Egypt or the weathered marble of the Greek police, the more that story begins to crack. Consider the golden grain of the Nile. Modern textbooks focus on the pharaoh, the singular figurehead who supposedly commanded the harvest from his throne. Yet the evidence suggests a vastly different reality. Beneath the surface of the state-sponsored narrative, we find complex, decentralized networks of grain storage, a system that functioned not because of top-down edicts, but because of a horizontal, self-organizing cooperation between the people themselves. These were communities that understood how to sustain themselves long before the concept of a tax-collecting bureaucracy had fully hardened. Travel further north, to the cradle of democracy, and you find something equally unsettling to the modern historian's status quo. We are taught that the Greek city-states were a prelude to the rigid bureaucracy of Rome, a stepping stone toward the state-centric world we inhabit now. But scratch the surface of the Athenian assembly, and you find a society that held a deep, ingrained suspicion of concentrated power. They didn't just stumble into complexity, they engineered it to be decentralized, favoring a web of self-governing networks where the voice of the citizen outweighed the reach of the official. So why is this nuance hidden away? Why has the vibrant, messy, and remarkably capable history of these ancient peoples been filed down into a simple, digestible fable about obedient subjects and divinely ordained masters? If the history of the ancient world is actually a testament to the power of human autonomy, then the narrative we are fed today, the one that insists we are small, fragile, and eternally dependent, is not a reflection of the past at all. It is a mirror designed to make our own submission feel inevitable. But what if the most important pieces of the puzzle weren't just omitted by accident? I mean, what if the most inconvenient evidence of these decentralized golden ages was systematically scrubbed from the record to hide the very possibility of a different way to live? The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that the true history of our ancestors is not a warning against chaos, but a map to a forgotten freedom. And the most startling realization of all lies in the one place they told us never to look. The dust of millennia settles heavily upon the ruins of the past, masking a truth that mainstream history prefers we leave undisturbed. When we look at the monolithic structures of Egypt or the precise harmonic geometry of the Hellenistic world, we are taught to see the handiwork of slaves driven by the whip to satisfy the egos of distant, godlike kings. But as we scrape away the layers of academic insulation, a vastly different reality emerges, a reality of radical autonomy. Consider the Egyptian master builders. These were not mere laborers performing repetitive tasks under the sun. No, they were high-level engineers who treated stone like light, manipulating acoustics and structural integrity with a mastery that defies our modern understanding of Bronze Age capabilities. They operated under a philosophy where architecture was an extension of celestial mathematics. They lived in a society where the pursuit of knowledge was a collective enterprise, a decentralized intellectual ecosystem. Yet, look at your textbooks today. They label these achievements as mystical or divine. By painting these ancients as people who moved mountains because they were obsessed with the afterlife, history sanitizes their genius. It makes their capabilities seem unreachable, magical, and therefore irrelevant to our own potential for self-governance. Then shift your focus to the Hellenistic scholars of Alexandria and beyond. Long before the collapse of the ancient world, these thinkers were calculating the circumference of the Earth with startling precision and building mechanical computers that wouldn't be rivaled for another 1,000 years. They understood that the universe was governed by laws accessible to any mind willing to observe and calculate. They were the architects of thought, building systems of logic that empowered the individual.
But why are they pushed to the periphery? Why does the narrative insist on relegating their brilliance to footnotes, as if their discoveries were lucky guesses rather than the result of a rigorous, autonomous intellectual tradition? It is because once you understand that your ancestors held the keys to sophisticated, self-reliant civilizations, you begin to question the necessity of the power structures you live under today. If they could build such wonders without the oversight of a suffocating centralized authority, right? Why are we led to believe that we are incapable of doing the same? The labels of mystical and divine were the original tools of erasure. By framing their mastery as something that transcended human logic, those in power ensured that the average mind would never attempt to replicate their independence. But there is a hidden, echoing signal in their work, a frequency that the history books failed to mute completely. And just when you think you've uncovered the motive behind this grand suppression, you stumble upon the most unsettling evidence of all, the specific artifacts that prove these cultures weren't just building for the gods, but for the people. But what happened to the records of that true horizontal society when the first great empires began their systematic collapse? The silence that followed the collapse of the ancient world was not a natural decay. It was a manufactured void.
To understand why your history books read the way they do, you see, you must look at the glowing embers of Alexandria. Imagine the biting scent of papyrus turning to ash, thousands of years of human achievement, medicine and astronomy and democratic philosophy, all vanishing into the dark Mediterranean night. This was not a tragic accident. It was a surgical strike against human self-sufficiency. When the great library burned, it wasn't just wood and ink that perished, right? It was the collective memory of a species that once understood how to harness the stars and the seasons without bowing to a central divine right authority. The Roman Church and the shifting imperial powers realized something vital. If you control the records, you control the reality. They didn't just want to rule the people, they wanted to rewrite the very definition of what it meant to be a sovereign individual. By systematically categorizing the achievements of the Greeks and Egyptians as pagan or forbidden, they effectively lobotomized the intellectual progress of the West for nearly 1,000 years. I mean, we are told this was a period of darkness, a simple gap in the timeline where nothing happened, but that is the lie that keeps the status quo in power. During this supposed darkness, the knowledge didn't disappear. It was sequestered. It was hidden behind high walls, locked in monasteries, and buried in deep archives, accessible only to a select few who used it to maintain their grip on the narrative. They replaced the ancient horizontal society, a world where knowledge was common property, with a rigid vertical hierarchy that demanded unquestioned obedience.
They erased the evidence of an era where humanity was capable of engineering wonders without the permission of a king or a bishop. They wanted you to believe that progress only began when they decided it should. But if the destruction of Alexandria was the first great act of censorship, then why did the Roman authorities go to such extreme lengths to ensure that specific scientific texts were hunted down and destroyed even centuries after the fire? There is a secret hidden within those missing scrolls, a truth about our potential that even today's institutions are terrified we might rediscover. But the burning of the library was only the beginning of the cover-up. Wait until you see what they did to the physical blueprints of the structures that still defy our modern understanding. The transition from the mystery of ancient ruins to the rigid order of the classroom was not an accident. It was a deliberate architectural shift in the human mind. By the time the 19th century dawned, the Enlightenment's hunger for untamed knowledge began to fade, replaced by the Industrial Age's cold, mechanical necessity. You see, society no longer required independent thinkers who questioned the origins of the pyramids or the advanced engineering of the Roman aqueducts. It required factory workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. To create this new standardized citizen, the powers of the era realized that history could no longer remain a fluid, investigative pursuit. It had to be locked in a cage. Across Europe and eventually the globe, the curriculum was consolidated into a single, sanitized narrative. Gone were the accounts of lost technologies and the complex, messy realities of ancient civilizations. In their place, history became a polished monument to national pride, a tool designed to convince the masses that their current rulers were the inevitable, divinely ordained successors to the greats of antiquity. Schools were modeled after the very factories they fed. Children were taught to sit in rows, to memorize dates, and to accept the state-approved version of the past without ever glancing at the shadows beneath the surface. It was a brilliant, stifling cage. By shrinking the scope of what was considered true history, the architects of this system effectively buried the evidence that civilizations once held capabilities that modern science still struggles to replicate. They wanted you to believe that progress is a straight,
upward line, that we are the apex of human achievement. I mean, if you were taught that the ancients were merely primitive people playing with stone and bronze, you would never think to ask how they achieved such astronomical precision, right? Or where their lost knowledge truly went. This standardized blueprint wasn't built to enlighten you. It was built to limit your imagination. But as the textbooks were printed and the curriculum solidified, there was one glaring discrepancy, a physical anomaly that kept showing up in the archaeological record, an artifact that refused to fit into the narrative of simple, primitive builders. And that single discovery is about to blow the lid off everything they told us about the origin of our own potential. We are taught to view the ancients through a narrow, clinical lens, as if the architects of Giza, the philosophers of Athens, and the engineers of Rome were merely cogs in a rigid, top-down machine. Solemnly, we are told they were slaves to god-kings, bound by superstition and limited by a lack of modern technology. But you know, this narrative is not an objective account of the past. It is a carefully constructed cage for your own ambition.
When you frame history as a linear progression of primitive ignorance evolving into our modern superiority, you effectively lobotomize the human imagination. You start to believe that autonomy is a modern invention, right? That the concept of a free, self-governing society is something that only began with our current political systems. This is the ultimate cost of historical amnesia. By painting our ancestors as mindless drones who only existed to serve the whims of emperors and pharaohs, the architects of our modern textbooks ensure you never look at the ruins of the past and ask, what if they were just like us, but with different tools? If the builders of the Parthenon were not merely subjects of a state, but individuals operating with a level of agency we've been conditioned to think is impossible, then the entire foundation of our current societal structure begins to tremble. We are kept tethered to the present because we are convinced that the past offers no alternative vision of how to live, how to organize, or how to thrive. I mean, think about it. We look at the megalithic stones of the ancient world and see a struggle of survival rather than a testament to a collaborative human potential that flourished without the bureaucracy we are told is essential today. This is why the discrepancy in the archaeological record is so dangerous to the status quo. It suggests that there were periods where the human spirit was not suppressed by the systems we find so suffocating now. And if they could achieve the impossible without the permission of the elite, then perhaps the blueprints for our own liberation have been hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the dust of millennia. But even as we start to pull back the curtain on this suppressed potential, there is one detail that historians have spent centuries trying to erase, a specific, recurring pattern found in temple foundations that proves the ancients knew exactly how we were going to be manipulated. And if you think the mystery of their autonomy is strange, wait until you hear what they carved into the stone to warn us about the very system you are living in today. Look closely at those temple foundations. Beneath the grandeur of the Parthenon or the monolithic shadows of the Great Pyramids, there is more than just mortar and stone. There is a silent, enduring testament to human defiance. For centuries, the authorized records have painted the ancients as mere subjects to their kings, cogwheels in a divine machine, destined only to serve and to vanish. But the stones, they tell a different story. They speak of architects who understood the very architecture of the mind, leaving behind patterns designed to bypass the censors of time and speak directly to a future generation, us. When you peel back the layers of history, really peel them back, you find that the true heresy was never the gods they worshipped, but the autonomy they cherished. The ancients were not merely builders of tombs, they were the first architects of independent thought.
They knew that empires rise and fall, and that the history books written by the victors would eventually attempt to erase the memory of what a free humanity looks like. So they carved their warning into the very bedrock. They encoded the truth in the alignment of stars, the geometry of their chambers, and the unspoken language of their art, ensuring that when the time was right, someone, perhaps someone like you, would come along to translate the message.
Reclaiming history is not about memorizing dates or listing the names of long-dead monarchs, right? It is an act of intellectual rebellion. It is the refusal to accept a narrative that insists you're a small part of a closed system. By looking beyond the shelf and challenging the sanitized versions of the past, you are doing more than learning. You are breaking the cycle of submission. You are proving that the ancients' efforts were not in vain, and that their legacy is not a monument to the past, but a blueprint for the present. The archives of the lost are far larger than any museum display would have you believe. There are truths still buried, concepts still waiting to be excavated, and patterns in our history that remain shielded from the light of day. If you are ready to look past the ink on the page and decipher the architecture of our own potential, then you belong here. Join us as we venture into the vaults of the forgotten. Subscribe to Hidden Epoch Narratives and begin the investigation into the history they didn't want you to know. The stones are waiting to speak. Will you be the one to listen?